Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 41 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. It is another one of those weeks. These are relentless. I've got to try and give you everything that's happened this week, and this week has been crazy yet again. I don't know how many times I can say that, but welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk. This is hard talk about hard money. We discuss everything that's happened this week in Bitcoin, in macro, and geopolitics. If we haven't met before and you're new to the channel, my name is Simon Dixon. I've spent the last 20 years of my life obsessing over the topic of Bitcoin investing and money, and I've documented the whole journey for you to be prepared to build and protect your wealth in a world that I'm forecasting of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies. So with that in mind, let's jump straight into this week in Bitcoin, in macro, and geopolitics. Just before I get started, do me a favor. Please do repost. Please do like. Please do share your comment. Let me know where you are tuning in from in the comment section. I do read all comments and reply to as many as I can. So without further ado, let's just jump straight in. If you didn't see it earlier, I went live for our third interview we did in the last few weeks. And I won't tell you who it is, but please check it out. It was with our next president, our next Bitcoin president for our next Bitcoin country. So check it out on my YouTube channel, Simon Dixon. You can see it there. It is a very interesting interview, and I enjoyed it. Today, what are we going to be covering as the main topic, the main theme throughout both Bitcoin macro and geopolitics? Well, I'm going to be letting you know Trump, RFK, or Harris, who's best for Bitcoin and who's best for peace, because those are the things that I care about more. Are we going to avoid war from the Federal Reserve and the proof of weapons network? The fiat currency proof of weapons network is in full force right now, trying as hard as it can to destroy humans, kill humans. And we are seeing it in full force right now. The Federal Reserve will be going berserk. Why? Because $2.9 trillion was wiped out of the stock market just a few hours before we went live with this episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk. And we know what comes next after a $2.9 trillion crash. For those of you that don't know, that is the largest one-day crash that we have seen since COVID. This is a little bit unusual for normal days. But we have seen this before. We know what comes next. Remember, America is not a free market. It does not believe in markets. And it is the most free market and probably believes in markets the most compared to everywhere else. But it is not a free market. Why? Because the Federal Reserve will be hinting at why it needs to lower rates, and the whole of America will be cheering on, saying, please push up the price of real estate. Please push up the price of stocks, even if it bears no reality to what's happening, because we love benefiting from the increase in the price of assets at the expense of those that are going homeless because they can no longer afford to live in a house, because a house is a speculative asset in a world without Bitcoin, where the Federal Reserve takes out savings and moves America from a free market to a socialist market to a communist market if they get their central bank digital currencies, while the whole world cheers on so they can make sure that they get on the right side of wealth inequality, which is destroying people's humanity and pushing them further and further onto the left and the right, to the point where they're more than happy to blow each other up when NATO expands and the proof of weapons network says, we're going to invest in some weapons. And they're saying, well, let's just get rid of those humans on the wrong side. And we believe it's those damn immigrants that we need to blow up and get the hell out, even though it is this very same system and fabric of the system that creates these refugee crises. Anyway, $2.9 trillion was wiped out from the stock market today. We know exactly what comes next. Money printing. It is the same thing we have seen. The money printing lobby comes along and says the Fed will come and save the day, and we must get lower interest rates so that we can stimulate the market and create more inflation to benefit those that have assets at the expense of those that does not have assets. So this is the worst day since COVID. But what is really interesting is normally Bitcoin goes down with the market historically, but it has a 4-year cycle which beats the market and every single asset ever since it's been in existence since 2008 as a resistance movement against the Federal Reserve, the oppression of central banks, and the corruption of the bank lobbyists that drive all of these trends to put everyone in debt slavery. Well, Bitcoin just said, we don't care anymore, which is really interesting. Now, this is just one day. One day is not a trend. I don't want to do the whole Peter Schiff technique where you take one day and then say, I told you so, when the clear trend is saying the opposite of what that one day is. So, we shall see. The stock market is not allowed to crash, and the Federal Reserve will always save the stock market until it can't save it anymore in a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and it will find ways of getting everyone deeper into debt in order to push up those prices. But that is fascinating that Bitcoin was unaffected. Imagine the game theory playing out here, where Bitcoin is now listed on the stock market through an ETF. And today we had the $1.3 trillion asset manager, Morgan Stanley, the largest retail brokerage in the world, announce that they're going to allow their advisors to offer the spot Bitcoin ETF to their clients. Now, their compliance department was messing around. They could have protected people from this stock market crash. They could have allowed people to sell their stocks and buy the Bitcoin ETF all within one account in order to make that a seamless experience and protect more people if they understand the trends. But they messed around, and now it is coming out. You'll be able to do that, but a little bit late in terms of the one-day correction. So we shall see next week what this means. But we'll go through the macro side and what it actually means for the general side as well. Now, before we do that, we're going to continue along the Bitcoin side. And everybody in America is in full swing, left and right, populism. I want to lose all my relationships. I want to no longer talk to people that I was perfectly good friends with because they don't believe in my political ideology, and I'm going to decide who I'm going to vote for. So if those of you that are 1 or 2 issue voters, and for me, I am one of those people, if I had a vote, I would be thinking about what causes the most amount of peace in the world. And I know there are 2 things that matter: giving people the ability to own their own money, spend their own money, and beat inflation, i.e. Bitcoin policy, and ensuring that the proof of weapons network does not kill us, so that if we save in Bitcoin, we actually come out the other side, war policy. Those are the 2 things that matter to me. I know for other people, there are all sorts of other things that matter, but for those of you that care about those things, I'm going to be covering the difference between RFK, the independent, Donald J. Trump, the Republican, and Kamala Harris, now that Biden stepped down from the Democrat side, and go through their Bitcoin policies and their war and peace policies in the geopolitical section. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. Now, it is a 2-party vote. We know that. Robert F. Kennedy probably has no chance of winning. But if you want the FU vote, it goes to RFK. And RFK presented at Bitcoin 2024. On my channel, I did, for those of you that want a deep dive, and it's really educational because I went through every word that Trump and RFK said and analyzed it in terms of Bitcoin, macro, geopolitical, the lies, the truth, what matters. And I went through every word. So although you might want to do it from a political perspective, do it from an educational perspective, because there was a lot of stuff and a lot to learn that really covered everything that I've been documenting in Bitcoin Hard Talk and my YouTube channel ever since I started providing content when I left investment banking in 2006 and started writing books and giving presentations on banking reform, and then found Bitcoin and presented at the first Bitcoin conference in Europe at Bitcoin 2011. So check out those presentations from Bitcoin 2024. For those of you that don't have time to do that, let me give you the TLDR and the Bitcoin policy from all the different politicians. So let's start with the one that gets Bitcoin the most. Unfortunately, as I said, he is owned by a lobby group. So one part of his policy is not going to drain the swamp, but he certainly gets the whole swamp. But he needs his funding from the lobby group that controls him, that really does the opposite of what most of his policy is. However, RFK no doubt has the best Bitcoin policy. So let me just go through what the different policies are and how that affects the Bitcoin market. So firstly, RFK said that he will transfer 200K Bitcoin from the Department of Justice as a strategic reserve asset for Treasury. Now, remember, this means Treasury, not central bank. Central bank and Treasury are two independent entities. There is a constitutional right for Americans to provide hard money and back it by gold, or hard money and sound money. The Federal Reserve took away that constitutional right when presidents fought 2 wars and got assassinated over making sure that the central bank does not take over America. But they lost the battle in 1913 when European central bankers funded the Federal Reserve and slowly took away all those constitutional rights. Now, rather than taking those Bitcoin and handing them over to the central bank, they're handing them over to Treasury, which allows the Treasury and the government to build independence from the central bank in case they want to reverse their policy. However, there is one boogie monster that I will cover. Those 200,000 Bitcoins don't even belong to America. We'll cover that a little bit more. The second policy of RFK is that he wants to purchase 4 million Bitcoin. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. And he wants the US government to own 4 million of them. How is he going to do that? He's going to dollar cost average every day by purchasing 550 Bitcoins per day if you make him president. He will also issue guidance to the Internal Revenue Service, those that collect tax in the US, that Bitcoin to USD is unreportable transaction, so that you can protect privacy. So if you convert your Bitcoin to dollars, then he will try and make that guidance to the IRS. The IRS will tell you, F you, no way. We want all those transactions, because the reality is we're broke and we need to tax people. And if we can't tax people, then we can't pay our politicians and we can't make the government bigger and bigger and bigger. And that was the reason why we struck a deal with the central bank in the first place, so we could create a debt-based Ponzi scheme, introduce income tax, and pay it all over to the central banks so they could prop up markets, issue more loans, and create the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme called the US dollar fiat currency. And we learned that from our British friends that taught us all about Ponzi schemes and how to take over society and create bigger and bigger governments. What else did he say? So, great, do it, but ain't going to happen. He also said that he'll make the conversion of Bitcoin to USD tax-free. Awesome, ain't going to happen, but I like the incentive, because that allows Bitcoin to act as a currency rather than just property. At the moment, if you're American and you spend your Bitcoin, and if the price had increased, you create a capital gain, which means that it's very hard to use as currency if you want to pay people. And so most people, they just keep it because they don't want to create taxable events. And that stops them from trading, which is a good thing. But it also stops them from spending, which may be a good thing. But at the end of the day, it takes away that real freedom of Bitcoin, which is owning your own money, self-custody, spending your own money without creating taxable events, and beating inflation because of his fixed supply, so that you can fight against the oppression of central banks and the debt-based US dollar Ponzi scheme. He also said that he'll make Bitcoin eligible for conversion into real property. This means you could buy property with your Bitcoin without creating taxable events, I think is the idea there. He said he will also support Bitcoin self-custody. This is constitutional rights, property rights to be able to own your own Bitcoin. All good stuff, so you don't have to own it through an ETF. But he did have a little bit of a contradiction. He said, I'm going to make sure you can own it because fight against the oppression of ETFs. But at the same time, I want the government to own it as well. So look out for some of those contradictions. But we can't have everything. He also said he would support running Bitcoin nodes at home. This means that while you own your own money in self-custody, you can fire up a node. There's about 100,000 nodes all around the globe, which is why we kept the block small in Bitcoin, so it's not prohibitive to run a node, and it means you can verify your own transactions that are being mined through miners, which is a good thing. He also said he will block the government and the Fed. So that means a GBTC, a government digital currency, and a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. He'll block them both from issuing. Remember, a government-backed digital currency allows the government to fight the oppression of the central bank, but he wants to ban both, which means that it would essentially crash the economy because that is the solution to when banks go bust, which is why we have to roll over the debt. And BlackRock gets to pull out the algorithms and tell the Fed which stocks to buy to prop up the share prices of his buddies, while bankers clip more and more out of the economy through inflation. He also said that he will explore a professor that he admires at MIT on how some research on how Bitcoin can be used for cybersecurity protection and therefore national security defense rather than attack, which is good. To look at these more, alternative uses of Bitcoin that we have seen. And he wants to support Bitcoin mining and to incentivize basically energy investments and support the Bitcoin mining industry, which is all good. There was a lot of presentation around how Bitcoin can support a renewable energy. And obviously RFK, he's been a renewable energy guy. So that's all good as well. He said that he will shut down the Fed. Thomas Massie, shout out to Thomas Massie, who's put in the End the Fed bill, understands that the Fed is unconstitutional and it has created this larger and larger government that has caused more distortions and all of this inflation. And promises not to sign into law a tax, let me get the right. Tax direct ownership of Bitcoin. So they won't tax if you own Bitcoin, like through some kind of wealth tax. Sounds like somebody has been watching Bitcoin Hard Talk, was my comments. But it is a open source movement, so we all get to share and benefit from all contributing to the largest movement that we know of, which is owning Bitcoin, which gives everybody the right to want to contribute to this movement, and it gets bigger and bigger every 4-year cycle. He also said that he will appoint a Bitcoin-friendly Treasury Secretary. He'd rather offer the job to someone like Michael Saylor or Caitlin Long. Michael Saylor gave a presentation really designed at nation states to create countrywide FOMO to own Bitcoin and take advantage of the opportunity. And Caitlin Long has been fighting the Federal Reserve in order to allow for a non-fractional reserve bank, a mission that I fought the Bank of England over way back in 2008, at the same time that Bitcoin was created. And Caitlin Long has been fighting the Fed and is exposing the corruption of how Fed will not issue licenses because the biggest threat to banking is full reserve banking, which is why stable coins is also an important part that comes from that. He also said that he would pardon Russ Albright, the creator of Silk Road. Enough is enough. He created technology that created more freedom. And he said he will also pardon Julian Assange. Enough is enough. If he wants to go to America, he'd be able to go to America if he got pardoned. And he can keep holding the government to account. But they will obviously use their financial blockades through Operation Choke Point 1.0, where they blockaded all the finance, and WikiLeaks got saved thanks to Bitcoin. And he also said he would pardon Ed Snowden, who obviously used WikiLeaks in order to expose the atrocities of the Proof of Weapons Network and the extreme human rights violations of the US government when they killed 1 million people in Iraq and all the other wars that came that in order to save Israel so they could be the sole nuclear power in the Middle East and exert regime change across South America, Central America, African continents, the Middle East, and Asia in order to push forward the military-industrial complex because it used the money from the Fed to buy politicians. And he said he will make that and oppress the war machine. So that is RFK's policy, which is why he would probably be assassinated just like his family if he had a chance of winning. So what do we do next? We look at the person that they tried to assassinate that is following the rules of the game of the lobbies after accepting 200 million from the Israeli lobby. And Trump said that he will try and do what he tried to do in 2016, but he's not talking about all the lobbies because now he is bought by the lobbies. In 2016, he was using his own money, and now the language has changed. So the 2024 Trump is very different from the 2016 Trump because he's not paying for the political campaign. He's using lobby money in order to pay for it, which changes the message and doesn't change squat. But it will lead to deregulation, and deregulation is a good thing. However, it doesn't lead to draining the swamp like many people think it is. And so he said that he will also transfer the 200K Bitcoin over and use the first rule of Bitcoin with the government, which is don't sell. He also said he will support self-custody Bitcoin. He also said he will block the government and the Fed from creating a central bank digital currencies. And he said, which is a crypto story, that he will fire Gary Gensler from the SEC, who has done nothing but support the only person that Gary Gensler met on multiple occasions from our industry was SBF, and SBF was a complete fraud money laundering operation that took contributions and took client money and bribed politicians, and they figured out how to say, we will put him in prison for 25 years, probably get 12 years on good behavior, but we don't need to look at any of the campaign financing. And they shut the case and said, let's not look at the Democrats or the Republicans and all the corrupt money that they were laundering through these bribes that they took from SBF. But Gary Gensler was completely connected with that. And he has been an enemy to the growth of the crypto industry. There is a distinction between Bitcoin and crypto. Bitcoin is digital hard sound money, and crypto consists of 22,000 pumps and dumps, with some of it going to actually make a difference. But the SEC has been after that, and there has been a back and forth from that. He also said that he would take Russ Ulbricht and he wouldn't pardon him, but he would say that you got to get away with the time that you have served already. That is it. That is his Bitcoin policy. So that is a much worse Bitcoin policy than RFK. But Trump is highly likely, if he doesn't get assassinated again with another attempt, to be the next president of the United States. But Biden stepped down. Kamala Harris has come along. She's likely to be the favorite to be nominated at DNC conference as the Democratic Party. So what is the policy of Kamala Harris? Well, we know what she did as VP with the Biden administration. They attacked crypto. And so she came out during the Bitcoin conference and said, let's do a reset, and reached out to all the different crypto companies, not necessarily the Bitcoin companies. And the Winklevoss came out and said, I'm contributing to Trump. Too little, too late. However, there is one thing that Kamala Harris can do right now. She can persuade President Biden to implement everything Trump said, and then we can believe her. And then we can decide, do you want to vote for Trump? Do you want to vote for Kamala Harris if you believe in Bitcoin? So Trump is talking about what he can do. You can try and believe him. Somebody that historically said he'll release the 9/11 files and didn't do it. He went on Alex Jones's show. He went on all the different shows and said that he would do it. But as soon as he realized that his buddies that are paying for him were redacted their names from the 9/11 files and the JFK files, he realized that that would be too much close to draining the swamp. I need the money from those lobby groups. Therefore, we will continue to not tell Americans the truth. So hold them account. Make sure that they release those files. America deserves the truth. And it won't really look good on America, unfortunately, if they realize the names that were redacted were the people that they're saying are America's best friends. We shall see. But Kamala Harris basically said that she will speak and reset with the industry. So my message to Kamala Harris, if you want to prove Americans that you believe in it, you have a massive advantage. You can persuade Biden that we know is not running America right now. We know that when we saw Netanyahu, he was the one that controls Congress, because left and right, they're all clapping like seals for Netanyahu. And all of a sudden, we'll cover this in the geopolitical, Netanyahu gets his way after showing Biden who the boss is of America. And immediately after Trump made that announcement, the Department of Justice sent 30,000 Bitcoin to Coinbase. Now, we don't know whether those 30,000 Bitcoin are going into custody or whether they're going into the exchange. But there was a big correction in the Bitcoin market leading up to the stock market crash because those 30,000 rather, we got a problem if we got 30 million Bitcoin. Those 30,000 Bitcoin were sent to Coinbase. I think it's likely they were selling, and I think this is due to the incompetency of government communication. So Kamala Harris, if you want to demonstrate that you are the next Bitcoin crypto person and president, and you want to reset, and you want the Bitcoin and crypto vote, don't sell those 30,000 Bitcoin and implement everything that RFK said right now, because you have the advantage, and show America that you doing it, and it's not just lip service. So that's what everybody needs to do. Now, immediately at Bitcoin 2024, we had about 30 Democrats sign a letter because they were saying, we're not associated with Gary Gensler. We're not associated with Elizabeth Warren. We want to shift away from, and we don't want to have an anti-Bitcoin or crypto stance. And so hold them to account. The Democrats are doing it. We've created this political, it is a political issue within America. So let's get as much shit done while we can, while this opportunity is here, because I don't hold any faith in politicians in America doing what they said they're going to do as they move on once they get the vote. So hold them to account, make them do it right now, engage in the process if you are American, and see what happens. We do have a bill right now to end the Fed from Thomas Massie, and US Senator Cynthia Lunas came out and introduced a bill to create a Bitcoin strategic reserve. In the bill, it says that they will purchase 1 million Bitcoin worth $65 billion at the current price. It's about 64 right now, but you get the point. Which would be, but there is a problem with this. As I hinted at earlier, those 200,000 Bitcoin do not belong to America unless they want to steal them. The reason I know that is because 95,000 of them belong to Bitfinex. And the person that stole them from Bitfinex, the wolf or the crocodile of Wall Street, which was, what was her name? Heather Morgan, a.k.a. Razzle Khan, was it Razzle Khan? She pleaded guilty to hacking Bitfinex. It was her husband, most likely. And they hacked 119,000 from Bitfinex back in 2016. Bank to the Future, the company that I co-founded, created a token on top of Bitcoin, which was the world's first security token that allowed Bitfinex to recover. Those tokens were sold by creditors in exchange for equity. And there was that was a security token that we created at Bank to the Future to support that recovery. And it was one of the highest performing investments out there. That security token meant that they became shareholders in Bitfinex. And those tokens, or those Bitcoin that are trying to be used as strategic reserve asset, a big chunk of them belong to Bitfinex shareholders. So promises are being made upon Bitcoin that America doesn't actually own. We shall see, and we shall track this. But the hacker that stole them was actually in Nashville. She's still walking around free, but I researched it a little bit further, and it turns out that her case and her sentencing will be happening in October or November this year. And remember, the other fraudster, Mijinski, will be going to sentencing and court case in January 2025 as well. So just a little reminder of a few of those cases. If you're interested in that story, Bank to the Future created a video, put in Bitfinex hack recovery, Bank to the Future, and you can see how that actually significantly outperformed all of the different bankruptcies. Why? Because Chapter 11 and bankruptcy is its own corrupt process, and many of the Celsius creditors are fighting still. I'll be doing an update on the blog, if you are a Celsius creditor, on everything that I know about what's happening with Ionic Digital, about the litigation and various other things beyond the scope of this. But keep an eye out for that blog. And if you're on my mailing list and you're a Celsius creditor, then make sure you're on the Celsius recovery solution so you get access to all those updates. Just go over to simondixon.com. There is a tab saying wealth building solutions. If you are a creditor or not, join the Bitcoin Hard Talk free membership portal where I give you all the resources to build and protect your wealth in a world of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies. And also, if you are a Celsius creditor, make sure you got access to the Celsius recovery solution or the exclusive recovery club if you're a non-US creditor and want to work with Bank to the Future to maximize that recovery. That's all on simondixon.com. Anyway, as I said, the DOJ sees some of those Bitcoin. The hacker has not been sentenced yet, and they were also at Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville. We will keep covering this story. It is an ongoing story. At the same time, in the intersection between Bitcoin and geopolitics and macro, Russia made an announcement this week and said they're going to legalize Bitcoin and crypto as a foreign currency for international payments. So Russia is making it where you can use Bitcoin for international payments as a currency. An interesting development. And immediately the president of El Salvador, Bitcoin President Bukele, he went over and proposes using Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to trade settlements between El Salvador and Russia. So now we're getting the settlement layer leading up to the October BRICS conference, where these resource-rich countries that have been sanctioned from the US, or they have been on the wrong side of regime change that we have seen with El Salvador, with Trump blaming El Salvador, not a good look. Fortunately, in Bitcoin 2024, he didn't come after Bukele, who's a member of the Bitcoin community. We are starting to see that these alternative corridors, resource-backed currencies are being used, and Bitcoin's being used as a settlement layer. We will keep covering that as we make that transition. We also saw a movement towards the SEC withdrawing further and further and further, but at the same time started launching new cases as well. So we don't know how to interpret this yet, but the Trump promise was to fire Gary Gensler, but there was an announcement that the SEC withdrew their what was it? Let me check. Their request. So much is happening. This even can't even remember exactly which ones. Oh, this was their so they withdrew from many of the cases that would classify certain tokens in the crypto industry, like Solana and Cardano, and it wouldn't be classified as securities. And so that was obviously treated as good news for the crypto industry. But don't confuse these things. Please do not confuse proof of work with proof of, what am I trying to say? Proof of work, proof of weapons, and proof of stake. That was the word I was looking for. So much to cover. I'm losing my words and doing Biden's. But yeah, do not confuse Bitcoin's proof of work with Cardano and Solana's proof of stake, because whoever owns the stake controls the network. And that is a big issue moving forward, which is why it will probably, like Ethereum, will probably be the most likely candidate for stablecoins and CBDCs moving forward. But as I always cover, you can use those trends in order to own more Bitcoin with the higher risk part of your portfolio. Beyond the scope of this right now, but they also withdrew their lawsuits against Binance, which is why those lawsuits would have classified those tokens as securities. And this is a general trend or a retreat of the SEC becoming the regulator and most likely moving everything over to the CFTC, as I predicted would happen a long time ago, with a new virtual asset service provider regime underneath the CFTC. And this means that they will come into basically make America similar to the rest of the world, because the Financial Action Task Force told the world that you need to have virtual asset service provider regimes. I think that's more likely to fall under, rather than the Securities and Exchange Commission regulating securities, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, which regulates commodities. And now we have said that Bitcoin is a commodity, and the SEC has retreated and said Ethereum is a commodity. once we got the ETFs, and we have started to see that progress as well. But they did launch a new case against BitClout. BitClout was a social media scam that came out, and they were charging BitClout founder. Let's have a look. This is a new case. Who's the founder? Nader El Naji. I don't know who that is, but they're charging him with fraud. The case said that it's unregistered offering of crypto asset securities. They've retreated from some of those, so let's see where this goes. But they accuse him of raising 257 million and spending about 7 million of it on personal expenses, and claiming that the network was decentralized when really he completely controlled it. We will follow that case and let you know everything you need to know on future episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Also, on the stablecoin side, we saw a report from Tether. Tether came out and said that they have made already this year from Q1 and Q2 $5.2 billion of profit in the first half of 2024. What does that mean? Well, this means at Bitcoin 2024, Cantor Fitzgerald came out and said that they custody all of the treasury backing Bitcoin, Tether, and it is over collateralized, putting an end to the whole story of, is Tether really backed? Well, Cantor Fitzgerald came out and said, yes, as a regulated financial institution, they need to stand behind those promises. And it is also supported by government, because stable coins are buying treasuries, which means that you cut the banks out of the middle. You go direct from government to a stable coin, which is the definition of full reserve banking. And full reserve banking is a big threat to fractional reserve banking. And we will see these inter-wars as everything gets more and more aggressive in the proof of weapons network. And what does those 5% that the US government is paying in order to borrow? Well, it buys Bitcoin with 15% of their profits. And so based upon these numbers, $5.2 billion of profits means that if they're taking 15% and buying Bitcoin, then they would have bought $780 million worth of Bitcoin in Q1 to Q2. Now, assuming a price of $65,000, but remember in Q1, the price was a lot cheaper, so it was probably a lot more. But let's take the conservative case. This means Tether is being subsidized by the US government and their debt to buy 12,000 Bitcoin at $65,000 per Bitcoin. And this is proving that non-fractional reserve business model, when combined with digital hard sound money Bitcoin, is a proven business model now. And we have got that ability to protect ourselves from fractional reserve banking as this whole evolves. So that brings us nicely into segueing into the macro section of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Do me a favor. I'm going to take a quick sip of water to protect my breath, to protect my voice. We still have the macro section and the geopolitical section of this week in Bitcoin macro and geopolitics. But YouTube does not like the content that I cover. So do me a favor. It's not going to rank it. I rely 100% on you making sure that you repost it, you share it, and at the very least, like it and put a comment below, because the algorithm will then make sure that some more people see it as well, because they don't like the content. You will understand why as we dive into the macro and the geopolitical side. So take this opportunity to do me that favor right now, and I'm just going to take a quick water break, and then we'll go right in to the macro content. Okay, thank you very much. Right, let's jump into macro, and then that goes into geopolitics. So what happened this week? Well, stock market crashed because it was FOMC, and the data came out today, and unemployment was worse than expected. Remember, markets do not move when things are as expected. The employment numbers were worse than expected, and therefore we had the largest correction since COVID, which wiped off $2.9 trillion from the stock market, and Bitcoin didn't care. But prior to that, at FOMC meeting, the Fed decided that it was going to hold rates while the whole of people that own assets were clapping like seals, saying, We want you to cut rates. And those that have assets were saying, please get ahead of this. Please cut rates. Please push the prices up because they don't believe in markets anymore. But the jobs data came out today and it was well below the forecast. So that was what caused the correction today. At the same time, the Bank of England this week, it cut rates by 0.25% at 5%, despite inflation still being a problem in Europe. And so the Bank of England, the ECB, they're trying to get ahead of it. They're trying to pump the Ponzi scheme and save the GBP Ponzi scheme, which will lead to more inflation, particularly as geopolitical tensions rise as well. This was the first rate cut since 2020. So we had the biggest correction in the stock market since COVID. And we also had the first rate cut since 2020 in the UK. At the same time, in the macro side, oh God, Milei, my friend, Milei, Malai, however we say that, the Argentinian president, he decided to take this opportunity to ship a chunk of the gold reserves of Argentina and send them to Rothschild & Co. in London. Do we learn nothing that is an awful idea and the very same reason why he should have bought Bitcoin for Argentina and hasn't done that yet? Because you can set up a multi-signature setup that allows you to store that Bitcoin, have it auditable, and publish it for your nation so people in real time can see some of the backing behind the Argentinian peso so they don't have to go to dollars, because he said he's going to close down their own central bank and rely fully upon the Fed. So far, his policy is he wants to rely fully upon the Fed and he wants to send his gold in custody in London to Rothschild. Basically, he's getting ready to send 2 million troy ounces of gold worth about 4.5 billion in custody to the Rothschild. We know what happened to Venezuela when they sent their gold and stored them at the Bank of England. The Bank of England basically just said regime change or no gold. And coincidentally, we suddenly get regime change based upon corrupt politicians, and the country will be wrecked, and we get Elon Musk and X interfering in politics in order to implement a regime change, which always leads, even when you chuck out those corrupt politicians, it always leads to a worse environment. This is why US foreign policy has always used their intelligence agencies, the CIA, in order to implement 400 different types of military actions and 65 different regime changes since World War II through covert operations that lead to more death and destruction, so that countries and America can take advantage of those resources, just like the British colonizers. But now we do it through covert regime changes by US foreign policy, we call it. Okay. So anyway, Bitcoin gives you the ability to self-custody, and instead, because he's got this heavy metal called gold, he now needs to incur shipping fees. He now needs to incur insurance. He now needs to make sure that it doesn't get lost in a boat, in a boating accident on the way to London. And it is now not auditable upon a blockchain, and Rothschild, through a Bank of England confiscation, can completely implement all the power that it needs over Argentina. Some would have thought maybe that was the plan all along, because that's exactly what happened to that. And what did the Bank of England announce this week? Well, it is announcing that it is going to be carrying out more experiments involving wholesale central bank digital currencies, what it's now calling WCBDC, in order to distinguish it from a retail central bank digital currency, where the central bank becomes the banker for the whole population. But firstly, it starts with a wholesale central bank digital currency, which is the large settlements between banks at the central bank using a blockchain. And it will be using not the Bitcoin blockchain, which is auditable. It will be using distributed ledger technology and private blockchains. Who's going to own those? Well, the lobby groups will, of course, own those. The same lobby groups that want to get the world into debt and get American taxpayers and British taxpayers and European taxpayers to pay for it, so that then they can push it out globally to the world through the International Monetary Fund and the economic hitmen in order to get the world addicted to euros, dollars, and pounds, and exert regime change where they can have coups d'etats, revolutions, and pretend that they are exporting democracy as they destroy countries that leads to resistance movements against it. Then the war lobby comes along and says, we'll provide the weapons for everybody. And then you radicalize people by blowing up their children and their parents and their grandparents, and certain forces that need to support those resistance end up being sanctioned. So those economies get destroyed, and then they can support the money printed by the Fed, send it over to those on the right side of the central bank, and then those money can be exerted back in order to execute political bribes and push the proof of weapons network funded by those that are deep in debt, paying 30% interest on credit cards and not being able to borrow at 0% interest from the central bank, while they try and believe that if they change it to a Republican government or a Labour government or a Conservative and a Democrat government, that it will make any difference when they're all bought by the same lobby groups anyway. And we call that democracy. Yeah, basically, we got this whole announcement from the Bank of England around these different signatures of deposits and how they're going to be using a blockchain with a WBTC as well. I won't go through the details. We'll cover that in future episodes as this progresses. At the same time, we had before this stock market crash, we had the US national debt reaching $35 trillion this week. At the same time, let's break that down a little bit. I put out a little bit of stats as well. So those that are deciding which one's better for Bitcoin, RFK, Harris, and Trump, let's see what their different policies did. So under Biden, of that $35 trillion of debt, how much of it was created by Biden? $7.2 trillion was printed by Biden since he took office. There was an interesting stat that was put out. It took 43 presidents, 215 years to add the first $7.2 trillion of debt. That is the power of the Federal Reserve turning the US dollar into an exponential Ponzi scheme and removing the gold standard. That's what exponential looked like. What else did Biden do? Well, he did it in 3.5 years to create as much money as it took previous presidents 215 years. Well, that's a reason to go Republican, right? Well, Trump's going to drain the swamp, right? Trump is going to control inflation, right? No, he is bestowed to the same powers. The only difference is you get deregulation in the same system of control, and you want somebody that maybe just less than 1% chance is saying, I'm 79, I've only got one term left, I'm actually going to drain the swamp. So while I take the money from the swamp, maybe I don't care. I will actually release the 9/11 files, release the JFK files, give the truth to America, and expose the proof of weapons network and so-called Friends of America for what it actually is. And maybe, just maybe, drain the swamp once and for all, and America can move to a different system. But the proof of weapons lobby will not allow that to happen. So what did Trump do in his last election? Because he said he's going to reduce that swamp. Well, he added in one single term the most amount ever to the national debt, $7.8 trillion. He beat Biden. and Kamala Harris or Trump will do the same again. Why? Because America doesn't believe in free markets, because the Fed created it and slowly took it away through this exponential Ponzi scheme called the dollars, where they can promise growth, but the growth will never beat the growth of debt. And you have, as long as people will buy those bonds, the Ponzi scheme will continue. It actually turns out, though, that Biden may be on track to beat that record because of the exponential cycle. It's got nothing to do with politicians and everything to do with central banks exerting excessive debt through intelligence agencies and assassinating the presidents that try to rein in on the central banks. But as I said, it took about over 200 years to accumulate that, but we've still got time for Biden to beat Trump's $7.8 trillion record, and that can easily be achieved through that, because it takes just 100 days to add the same amount of debt as it used to take 200 years intergenerational. But what's happening at the same time? Remember, after World War II, the Bank of Japan was occupied by the Federal Reserve, and they created that debt-based Ponzi scheme between the Bank of Japan and the Federal Reserve. And now that whole trade, the carry trade they call it, is all unwinding as well. So Japan is, through their own debt-based Ponzi scheme that had created so much inflation, is now pulling out of the US bond investments. And they're actually need to stabilize their currency by not investing in US bonds anymore. That carry trade is unwinding in front of us. So where is all the volume? The largest investor in US debt is Japan, the Bank of Japan. That trade is now over. So where is the rolling over of the US dollar Ponzi scheme going to go in order to keep it alive? Well, that's why they like stable coins, of course. Stable coins could take the bank out of the middle and create full reserve banking. We will watch that trend with interest, because stable coins, the more that are issued, the more treasuries they buy, and they can keep the scheme going. And of course, they're going to ask American people to buy it. So while the rest of the world says, I don't like what's going on there, they'll be going to American people to try and make sure that you buy more bonds. And they'll probably obfuscate it through central bank digital currencies and stable coins. That's the word I was looking for. Okay, so they need to reduce that liquidity coming from Japan, and a new trade needs to emerge. This is why America needs a Bitcoin strategic reserve asset, because it needs to protect itself from the Federal Reserve. And this is why it is so important to judge Kamala Harris. Does she have the clout to push Biden to do what they did in the reversal of the attack on the Bitcoin and crypto market, with forcing the SEC to reverse it? Can they do the same with ensuring that the Department of Justice does not sell those Bitcoin? We shall see. If they disclose that they have sold that Bitcoin, then we know that everything is words. And if they don't reverse that policy, then it looks like Trump is a dead cert for the Bitcoin vote, for all the reasons that I gave in the Bitcoin segment. If you want to know why, go back to the beginning of this section where I covered Bitcoin, or head over to the video where I unwind and went through every single word of Trump and JFK. And you can get those videos on Simon Dixon, my YouTube channel. Right, so at the same time as $35 trillion of US debt being reached, and we had the unwinding of the Japan and America carry trade, we of course had $1.7 billion going to Ukraine. And we had 30,000 Bitcoin being sent to Coinbase. This is like reverse dumbass strategy. And that needs to be reversed immediately if there is any type of solution to beat the end of the debt cycle that we are experiencing right now in the exponential debt phase of America. And that is going to be everything for the macro section. So we've done the Bitcoin section, how that impacts the macro section. And now let's move over to this week in geopolitics. And we had two major events, which is the Middle Eastern side with the escalations between Iran and Netanyahu telling America that you must fight war with Iran and that you will die for Israel and troops must do that, all because they want you to defend those illegal nukes that they have that would normally lead to sanctions and led to the escalation with Iran when France tried to do a deal with Iran in order to do through diplomacy, and Israel reversed it and brought America into the fake war on terror with lots of false flag operations that made you feel a certain way, and intelligence agencies manipulated and the media manipulated you into thinking you need to do it for your security. And of course, that is what we saw with Netanyahu coming to Congress. It was the most shameful moment that I have ever witnessed in American history when Biden started to hold back those 2,000-pound bombs from the genocide that is happening, as Netanyahu said he's going to expand it to Rafah, which was the safe zone. And Biden said, we're not sending those weapons over. Hold on. This is going to get a bit too aggressive. And the lobby obviously had its word and said, Netanyahu, you need to get your ass over to Congress and show Biden who runs America. And so Biden came. So Biden was sat around sleeping while Congress clapped like seals and gave a standing ovation to Netanyahu as if he was Abraham Lincoln and JFK returning from the dead in order to tell the world how he's going to take America to war with Iran. He got a bigger ovation. And he taught lie after lie after lie in order to make you feel a certain way. Now, do not remember that if you've watched previous episodes, the ICJ already classified Netanyahu a war criminal that needs to be arrested if he enters into your borders. UK said that they will have to in order to protect international crime, despite all the bribes they receive from the Israeli lobby. They still have to arrest him, but America says no, because there is only one country left holding the whole damn thing up, and we got a display of why that is. And that is what we saw in Congress as well. It was a really embarrassing display for the rest of the world. But essentially, what did he cover in the Congress speech? I covered this briefly on some of the other videos, but let me give you a recap of the situation, because we are expecting, and it may be happening right now as we speak, that Iran will be retaliating within Israel, and this could have very, very dangerous effects. But this is exactly what Netanyahu told America they need to do and manipulated the situation to force it, because it looked like it wasn't going the way that he wanted it. And so he basically came to Congress and said, you need to go and join me in the war against Iran. It is the barbarians versus the civil. Okay. Remember what I covered in previous episodes. Everything that I said last week happened. I thought it was going to take longer, but it actually all happened within a week. Remember that I said, I think the underlying goal here is to expand NATO to West, what they call the Middle East, which is actually West Asia, and East Asia, the Far East as well. And so NATO wants to expand the proof of weapons network, so the proof of weapons network can print more money, roll over the Ponzi scheme, backed by every single country printing more money, which destroys their currencies, so it can all go back into America, into the war machine and the defense contracts. And you need a big, scary event in order to justify that. We have seen this story hundreds well, not hundreds, that's an exaggeration, but we have seen this story many, many times as well. So my prediction was that this is all about Israel becoming that leader and the sole nuclear power in the Middle East, and the Israeli government is manipulating US in order to force that expansion. And so Netanyahu had to come and speak to all the important people so that he can, push forward their AI military industrial complex. Remember, there's two major industries in Israel: AI military and also cybersecurity. And so those industries, even though they were paid for by America, they want to sell all of that back to the world, and they're testing it on, if you've watched the Palestinian Laboratory, or if you've read that book, they're testing all of that on Gaza through occupation as a service, so they can export that to all oppressive regimes around the world when they want to overthrow governments through regime changes that they need to justify to everybody. So you've got this AI military industrial complex and cybersecurity industry being built in Israel, and Israel wants to be the center of that. And so Netanyahu had to come, and so he met with Biden, and Biden's pushing for a two-state solution. Netanyahu said, we'll never allow this. Our plan all along was to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians and expand Israel into Greater Israel. We've got to make sure that you sanction the international court and support us. And so he told Biden that he needs to continue doing that. But I need to first do a public display to show you who controls Congress. And by the way, that is what it was all about. It was showing that Biden, the president of the United States, has no support from Congress, while Netanyahu, a foreign president, has all the support from Congress. And he said, we need more bombs. You will pay for our military industrial complex. And so Biden had no choice but to send to them. Remember the 2,000-pound bombs that Biden was holding back upon? But he needed to also show all of the other people that may be in charge as well. Now, originally it was going to be used for expansion in Rafah, but now it's going to be used for expanding the war to Lebanon, because if you look at the IDF, the badge on the side, it shows that Israel is also West Bank, Lebanon, parts of Egypt, parts of Syria, and that's the greater Israel vision that they've always had. It's always been on their uniform. This was always the plan. And remember, before Abraham Accords, he stood up a sign and showed that that is the plan for Greater Israel. They need to colonize all these different areas. But unfortunately, Iran is the enemy because Iran is the colonizer, according to Netanyahu. And so that's why you feel that way, because they create all the stories to make you feel that way. So I believe that those bombs are now going to be used in Lebanon. And I predicted last week that it would escalate. And as soon as they got that standing ovation from all of Congress in America, he would go ahead and you would get some kind of operation that justifies a war with Lebanon. Go back and see it last week. Well, before the meeting could even be ended, we suddenly got this new escalation. What is it? We are now told that everyone needs to go to war with Iran because, firstly, Iran assassinated Trump, according to Netanyahu, or tried to do that. And also, after October the 7th, which all of the independent research that has been done said that that was completely different to how it was reported. But now we've got the worst day since October the 7th that we all need to talk about. And immediately that leads to this expansion. So what happened? Well, immediately after the clapping of all of the US Congress showing who's in charge, we got a movement from the IDF away from Gaza at the south and over and up to the north in order to get ready to attack Lebanon. But they need the justification at the same time. Remember, both US, Hezbollah, and Iran, and all of the Lebanon as well, they don't want war. They said that this will always be, you do something, we retaliate in the same way. And so far, the rules of engagement have been completely followed. But as soon as Netanyahu turns up in Congress and shows the US who controls Congress, all of a sudden we get this big escalation because they want to draw the US into war with Iran. So what actually happened? Okay, covered all of that as well. So remember, the goal is that just like, the reason Iran was pushed into the nuclear deal in the first place, they tried to do a nuclear deal with France. Israel didn't like it, got in the way of that. That led to sanctions and everything that came next. There was a revolution. That was the motivation to say that the regime change hasn't worked. So they start protecting themselves in order to build a nuclear arsenal, because North Korea protected itself, and all the other countries have shown that if you have a nuke, you can protect yourself and you don't get regime change in your country and you don't get on the wrong side. And so, and then Israel said, if you ever expand that, we're going to bomb you. And they want US to do that because they need the protection of the US in order to do that. This is why you ended up with Iran funding the different areas. Basically, Iran funded some of the different militia groups in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and they call them Iran proxies, despite the fact that they were just simply funding, and they were different organizations that were bombed from the US. All of those places were bombed from the US. And the reason that Iran ended up backing Hamas is because it wanted to support the resistance movement in Gaza. But remember, Netanyahu also, because he controls the Israeli shekel central bank in Israel, the central bank of Israel, and no money can get into their occupied territory unless their banks allow it. And so Netanyahu allowed those banks to put money into Hamas as well. And therefore, that would destabilize and detopple the Palestinian Authority, which is the government that US implanted through their regime change. And so by Netanyahu allowing that, he knew that it would be destabilization effect, and anything that happened from there, they could use in order to justify the complete ethnic cleansing. And if they got really extreme, then he could go for full-blown genocide and famine, cut off all the supplies, control the air, control the land, control the sea, cut off the internet, cut off everything. And now we've got polio and famine that is killing what has been estimated by the reports at 180,000 deaths, is now probably going to be much, much larger as we are seeing the humanitarian crisis roll out. Remember also Hezbollah, where did it come from? Well, it was a resistance movement after Israel invaded Lebanon in the first place. And so they have strengthened it. October the 7th suddenly happens. And that was used and weaponized in order to push forward what I call the NATO expansion, sole military Israel, and driving US into the war and taking on the justification. The only thing that's getting in the way of that is obviously Iran having its power and then supporting the various different factions that were on the wrong side of regime change and decided to fight against regime change. And then we have to have this game of politics where we call one side defense and the other side terror. And we create the media justifies and puts out one side of the story so that everybody can fall for it. And we feel like we're in a holy war. Okay. So remember, we've had Netanyahu public display telling Biden how US politics is going to work. Now he needs to go meet Harris. And so Harris puts up a fake show. Kamala Harris says, well, I'm going to not go to the Congress because the Americans and all the Jewish people that are against Israel and the genocide, they tend to be on the Democrat side. And this is becoming like a fake bipartisan issue where we're saying on the right is pro-Israeli and on the left are the crazy communists and terror supporters, and we need to classify them. But she knows she needs to get her voters. So she says, I'm not going to go to Congress and I'm going to boycott the speech. So that plays to a certain part of the voter. And And then she gives a speech and a statement, which is much, much better than what Trump gave and what Biden gave in their comments, kind of pretending that they must end this humanitarian crisis and Palestine must have self-determination. And this is destabilizing the region and could lead to a regional war, all things that are true. But Israel has its right to defend. And what that is interpreted as is the status quo. You carry on the illegal occupation. Please get back to a two-state solution, which Netanyahu has said he won't do. And then we can pretend that we're the good people trying to stand up for the Palestinians. And we will continue sending you all of that money. And then you can send that money back in order to bribe our politicians and pump up those stock prices of the war machine. So she said the things to make it look like she cares about the humanitarian crisis, but obviously all of the action. So remember, you can say you support Bitcoin and crypto. You can say you support peace, but we need to see that by actually implementing the Bitcoin policies and defunding Israel so that we can get back to peace negotiations, which is obviously the China plan. And America doesn't like the China plan because China has a peace plan and America has a war plan. And that is not something that could be understood by the world. So they need to use the media in order to make it sound like things are very, very different. So that is what we got from the Harris statement, which is essentially the status quo, illegal occupation, but make a fuss so that it looks like you're on, you care as well in order to appease the left wing and Democratic voters. So that's what I got from the Harris side in terms of their policy on peace. So far, we have Biden and Harris that will lead to escalating war with Iran. Yes, he didn't start any wars, but he did do bombing in Syria, bombing in Yemen, and did do more in order to escalate what later happened on October the 7th by trying to take Palestine cause completely out of it, which is at the center of the peace negotiations in order to move forward without the proof of weapons network. So this was interesting because in 2020, Netanyahu publicly supported Biden when Trump was saying that the election was rigged. And Trump very publicly didn't shake his hand and walked away, and they haven't spoken ever since. But now he needs to get elected. He took 200 million of Israel lobby money, and now suddenly there was no issue, and we just need to forget about it. We need to forget about all the things that actually happened. And he was welcomed back, and he had dinner and said, I don't know why any of the Jewish people could vote for Kamala Harris. It was very disrespectful. Then said that, talked at the Bitcoin 2024 conference that what happened with the escalation was an attack by Hezbollah on Israel. And we'll go through a little bit more why that's important, because that's the one that's going to lead to the big escalation event that may even be happening right now, or could happen this weekend, or could happen next week. But I'm pretty sure that next week I'll be talking about the escalation that we talked about this week, just like we were last week. I remember Elon Musk was there as well. He looked like, did you see that footage at the Congress speech where he kind of looked like a hostage? Like, yeah, you have to pay that. Now, remember, a lot of the data from X is going into these cybersecurity solutions, and a lot of that data is being used in order to fund the AI network. We're told it's a free speech platform. It is in a certain extent, but also there is a deeper plan and deeper power that we can see rolling out in front of us as well. Right, so Netanyahu suddenly has to return back early. Why is that? Okay, so let's go through the escalation, and then we can do some predictions on what happened next, and then we'll wrap up on who's best for peace. So the headline and what Trump said at the Bitcoin 2024 speech was that Hezbollah struck Israel and 12 were killed, and that consisted of 6 children that were playing football, which is absolutely tragic. Please, world, can we just stop killing children? we have one duty in this world, and that is really to protect our children and our innocent children. Why do we have all these pedophilia rings and bribery networks and Epstein files that Mossad and CIA and MI5 are using? And then we have these fake wars on terrors that are creating all of these, these killing of children and these regime change that leads to the killing of more children. Can we just leave the children out of it? Well, anyway, so we had conflicting story, and I don't know which one to be the truth, but all I know is that so far Hezbollah has always taken ownership of anything that they do, and they have played within the rules of engagement and said, until Palestine is free, we will continue this tit for tat, and whatever Israel does, we'll do too. And we will stop only once Palestine has self-determination. So that's been the rules of engagement. But there was a break of the rules of engagement, and we suddenly get this event that is called the worst day for Israel since October the 7th. That is designed to conjure up a certain emotion. So what actually happened? Well, the only person that said this was a Hezbollah bomb was Israel. And we've seen that that intelligence is always manipulated. And Hezbollah said it wasn't us. You believe what you want to believe, but we will see in the end. The EU came out and said, we want an independent investigation. But Israel said no, just like they wouldn't allow anyone to do an independent investigation on October the 7th. And we found out that things were drastically different to how it was actually reported. And so an article came out immediately saying that this was an Iron Dome failure. And so there was, in the Iron Dome, you have missiles being launched to counter other missiles. And so either it was a mistake because a missile was launched from Hezbollah, this was a counter missile, and then it did this accidentally, or it was Hezbollah. But does it make any sense that they would target this? I'll help you understand more. Or it was a mistake on the Israeli side, or it was a false flag. We will find out. But Hezbollah didn't take responsibility for it. And now Netanyahu needs to come back, and those bombs need to be used in order to expand the war to Lebanon. And then the flag that's on the side of the IDF, Israel can look more and more like the greater Israel vision that they always had. So what is this area anyway? So firstly, they said it was Israel. It wasn't Israel. It's occupied Golan Heights. Golan Heights is a disputed area after the Syrian occupation. And these are not Israeli people. These are called Druze. And Druze is a certain tribe, an Arab tribe of people that came from Syria. They were, I did a little bit of research and spoke to my people in the know about these stuff. They were offered Israeli citizenship a lot later, but they wanted to keep their Syrian identity. And some took it, but most of them didn't take Israeli citizenship. So they basically right now there's this fence between Syria and the occupied Golan Heights, and some of them are on the other side of the fence, and they can actually speak to their family in Syria through a fence, but they can't actually cross the fence. And so they can speak to their families. But this all happened during the Syrian war when there was ISIS takeover, which we know is an organization that came from the detoppling of Saddam Hussein. And by killing 1 million Iraqis, you had this escalation into what became ISIS. And then intelligence agency used it in order to justify. And we've got all of the WikiLeaks data that shows that the CIA uses it, Mossad uses it, and in order to make you feel a certain way. And that was, that was used in the takeover. And then remember, Trump put all those bombs out there and said, we took that ISIS away. I'm not saying it fully because of the algorithm. But anyway, the point is that these are not as it was reported. Hezbollah said they didn't do it. Now, whether you believe they did it or not, even the Israelis say that they believe everything that Hezbollah says because the leader tends to tell the truth. And they take everything he says very seriously. So EU came out and said that we want an independent investigation to find whether it is true, Why did they do that? Because they know this is so escalatory into a Middle East expansion and a complete regional war. So we've seen this before. We get this atrocity propaganda. And by the way, rest in peace, everybody and the children that were disgustingly, in full display, the victim of these disgusting acts. But even Netanyahu went over there, and we saw the videos where they were booing him out and saying he wanted to get a photo op, pretending that he's welcomed there. And you saw all the videos where they were protesting against him, and they were speaking out. And there was all those videos speaking out against all the Israeli government lies, and that you will not be able to use this in order to escalate a war in Lebanon. Anthony Blinken, of course, he came out in America and said immediately it was Hezbollah, and said it like it was fact, even though. And so that then leads to the weapons being sent, Congress being happy, and the US press conference justifying it, so that now what Israel does next, we can say that was Hezbollah's fault. So remember the rules of engagement right now. Hezbollah has told us publicly they will match whatever Israel does from here. Israel decided to escalate it to the next level this week. This was all after my broadcast where I said they would do this last week. They did. US called Israel and said, do not bomb Beirut, whatever you do. That is too far. But because the whole of Congress was clapping like seals, Netanyahu had a meeting with the war cabinet, and they decided to bomb 7 strikes in Lebanon, kill more civilians, and take out certain military targets and certain senior officials. And they also matched that with bombing in Iraq, take out some of the more military militia, like the people in charge of that as well. I don't want to use the names. You can find it, those that does the as well. But remember, Iraq has a lot of US bases. So Iran has, the ability to take out these US bases. This leads already to US deaths. This is US deaths because of Israel's policy as well. This is not good. This is not good. And then what did Israel decide to do? Well, rather than coming out, so the way Hamas works is it's got 2 divisions. It has the political division and the military division. The military division were the ones that were responsible for October 7th, and the political division are responsible for all of the government acts, because they run Gaza. And there was a leader of the political division that was in Iran, and he was in charge of all the peace negotiations that apparently America tell us it is Israel that wants peace and it's Hamas that doesn't. Well, why did it that they decided that the one to target is not the military leaders? They want the military leaders to continue because they want to justify the ethnic cleansing and genocide. So instead, they take out the one of the political division that is in charge of negotiating peace. And today he had his burial in Qatar today, so that there is guarantee that no peace negotiation and no peace deal can happen. So the peace deal is completely over. And they did that within Iran, within Iraq, within Lebanon. So in one fell swoop, they can force America to send all the bombs, and we can have the ability for all the allies that need to defend. And so immediately this was led with a bunch of warships from the US being sent to the Middle East, just as Israel wanted, and in the exact purpose of the visit. The whole world, all of the world diplomats, they begged that that this wouldn't happen, and Israel just decided, because he got the claps from US Congress, that it was okay and he could do that. So we're in massive escalation right now, and we are waiting. And as I said, it could be escalating right now because Iran has said that it will respond. Hezbollah in Lebanon has said that it will respond. Yemen in the Houthis in Yemen, they probably want to have a response as well. And so this is a big escalation. We've seen this one before when they took out the council, the consulate in Lebanon before. That led to Iran's retaliation in April, and now they've said that this one is going to be worse. Now, what does this do? Let's get back to the macro based upon the geopolitical. Well, if Yemen's involved, we know what the impact of that is already. This impacts all of the oil prices. This impacts, threatens Saudi Arabia's model. This is what the China peace deal wanted. China has started to escalate diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And this is what China wants to do. But if you disrupt the oil flow, because by escalating with Yemen, then you can make sure that that doesn't happen as well. Remember, this threatens the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, which is where all the shipping is happening right now. That creates more inflation. This is a big part of all the global shipping as well. Now that impacts Egypt. Egypt relies upon a lot of that revenue from that shipping happening. And remember, Egypt is controlled through their IMF debt as well, the currency destruction. They lost all their dollar reserves because they needed to keep printing the Egyptian pound in order to fight back against the IMF debt, which is what has created double-digit inflation within Egypt. Now their economy gets wrecked and wrecked and wrecked further. It also drags the US and the UK deeper into their wars that they're currently occupying Iraq and Syria. That means that ruins the kind of hegemony or the status quo that happens right now. What does Russia do? Russia depends upon the Syrian the port that it negotiated by supporting in the, where Saudi Arabia, US, UK, and Russia were all on the same side in order to try and take ISIS out of Syria as well. They had that operation. They got the port, which is how Russia does the exports and how Iran is able to do their exports as well, which is why Syria had to have US regime change. And then it turns it into a state and Russia had to protect it. So you end up with interception there. How does that impact that? Well, remember, Iran is the one that's exporting these cheap drones to Russia that are then being used in Ukraine. And remember, those are coming from Taiwan as well. Taiwan supplies all of the chips. And then what if China starts to say, well, this is starting to get a little bit heated? Then China decides this is the time to reunify with Taiwan. That stops chip flows into the US. If you stop chip flows into the US, you have an event bigger than the financial crisis that will make $2.9 trillion that came off the stock market today look like a tiny sneeze. This is the impact and how close we are coming when you follow Bitcoin, when you follow macro, and when you follow geopolitical trends. This is why everyone begging the Fed to reduce rates because they believe inflation is under control is trying to get ahead of a debt-based Ponzi scheme because Saudi Arabia controls the price of oil. And it is making sure that China doesn't reunify with Taiwan. And that goes all the way back to freeing Palestine. And this is why freeing Palestine is so important. Because without it, and there's only one country that doesn't want to do it, and this is why I focus so much in understanding Israel and the geopolitical impact of all of it. And it is only Israel that doesn't want to free Palestine and wants to draw US into war, which has this knock-on effect. And so you get these operations in order to justify it, and you're all being fooled into thinking that this is about something else. So what other forces are there? Then we can start to see that there is a little bit of a game, and I want you to recognize it. I'm not going to go deep into it, but recognize it as it happens in front of us, because we've seen it all before when you study history. Remember Netanyahu in the speech, he said he wants to run the Abraham Alliance. What is the Abraham Alliance? It is those that are trying to protect themselves from regime change by using the US military industrial complex, like Bahrain, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, like Jordan, the ones that are in the people want to free Palestine, but the governments can't because they're in this alliance. That is an expansion of NATO and the AI military industrial complex that I talked about, so that they can expand occupation as a service through complete control of data, which is why all the data and all the cybersecurity companies are going through Israel at the moment. And the only people that are fighting against that, we're told, they're terrorist groups and all that type of stuff. And so, we need to feel a certain way. What else have I got for you? I think I'm going to cover the rest as well. But what I want you to watch out for from now on, firstly, is obviously the escalation. So Iran has publicly say it will do a worse than April version, and that will be from the different axes as well. Now, they have a few choices. What could they do? Well, hopefully, as they always have, target military. They haven't tended to target civilians, even though Israel tells you they do. But one thing they could do is target the electricity. And so if the electricity goes, remember that will have an impact on all of this thing. We already saw what happens when you have a company like CrowdStrike, when they go out. Imagine if the electricity goes out in Israel, and then you have all these impact of all the cybersecurity companies going down, and then you have the impact on all the US companies and the flights and everything. This is why we need peace. It just makes sense. And we need to fight and resist against this. And this is why the expansion of the Israeli vision of the Middle East is just a bad thing for all of us. Anyway, so keep an eye out for that. And the final thing I want you to keep an eye out for as well is a lot of the expansion that we're seeing. So we started to see this week, moving stories on, that because of this, we are seeing the expansion of NATO forces, another alliance to protect Taiwan against China. And so Japan has come out and they said that we're ramping up the number of US troops that are going to be in Japan. They're scaling up weapons production and working with more and more US companies. They're putting more and more US troops into Japanese bases. Philippines said that it's going to have 4 new bases. Japan said that they've currently got about 50,000 US troops in Japan. And that Japan is going to be expanding its military industrial complex to provide more war supplies. In fact, Japan has now doubled its defense spending in reaction to the Russia and North Korea announcements that we're seeing. What else have we seen? We saw as well an announcement from the US that now US, based upon the NATO conference, it wants to place more missiles in Germany. This is a reversal of the agreements from the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so Putin came out and he said that if US puts more weapons within Germany, then that is a return to the Cold War. And we have gone backwards from the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the rules of engagement completely fall down. And so as a reaction to all of this as well, we saw the Turkish president Erdogan, which he's just lip service. He's a member of NATO, but is deciding which side of this does he want to be in. So as a result of ignoring everybody, Erdogan said that he is now threatening to invade Israel, which is a large military industrial complex, if Israel puts troops on the ground and invades Lebanon. So they've already done strikes. But if this escalates to a war, Turkey has already said that it will escalate as well. And now that brings in NATO. Again, I don't believe that that's going to happen. This is kind of like a reverse NATO expansion. So I don't really expect it to happen. But this is, the more of the types of trends that I've been predicting. So Israel can run the NATO in West Asia, and Japan and Philippines can put forward the expansion in East Asia. But then what do we need to look out for? Well, we got a little signal, and this will be the last story, and then we can wrap up. This is how much happens in 1 week. Look out for regime changes and the impact that it will be happening. This is why all eyes were on Venezuela this week. We have seen this story before. Now, again, people confuse me for thinking that I'm supporting governments. All these governments are engaging in all sorts of evil. And I'm thankful that thanks to Bitcoin, I have the freedom, and because of the luck of where I was born, that I have the freedom to live where I want, where I can expose what I want to expose, and you can push back through freedom of speech and let me know whether you disagree. But we have seen regime change. So even if you hate Iran, even if you hate all these countries, even if you hate Russia, even if you hate China, regime change never works, and it replaces a stabilized country with a completely destabilized country. So what I want you all to do right now is watch Venezuela and see what happened. It's not a country that I spent much time on, but I will be spending a lot more time on today. One of my interviews that I did today is with the presidential candidate in what may be the next presidential country. And I'll leave for you to find that on my YouTube channel and watch it, because her father was a victim of this corruption in these regions. And these corruption in these regions start with telling everybody that you need to change it because you don't like the human right violations. And then justify those human right violations. You get invasions and wars starting in countries like Iraq, regime change in Libya, supported by US, the same in Sudan, supported by US, the same in Syria, supported by US, the same in Yemen, supported by US. And then behind that, the UK just follows US. And why are these industries geopolitically centered around Israel in the Middle East and Northern Africa? Because Netanyahu says that the US needs to do it through Congress control. So watch what happens in Venezuela. Just watch it. We're told that you have this big evil boogie monster, and I'm not saying he's not an evil boogie monster. He probably is. But we clearly see that this same trend is playing out in real time right in front of us. We are meant to be concerned about the corruption in Venezuela. And all governments are corrupt, which is why I want to shrink them all through Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is a movement and a resistance movement against the central bank. And we can opt out of all this shit by not using their fiat currency proof of weapons network, and instead use proof of work and Bitcoin as a peaceful resistance against it. But we're now told that we need to be concerned about the corruption. Now, there were multiple forces that were in there in order to determine whether this, and you get these crazy, like, massive support. We know it's all bullshit. But we don't want a regime change, because a regime change always gets worse. So why in today's technology, in today's world, can we not have technology that really undoubtedly shows us fair elections? Interestingly, Guatemala timestamped all of the votes to the Bitcoin blockchain. And when the accusations of political corruption were contested, rather than revoting, they just turned back to those immutable timestamps on the Bitcoin blockchain. And this supports transaction fees, which means that as Bitcoin block reward, as a reward for miners, needs to be replaced with transaction fees, then these different timestamps on the blockchain are what people will pay for, which will subsidize the security of the network in the future, which drives the innovation on layer 2 to get the fees down, which is this perfect free market that is what all of our governments are meant to do, give us sound money and hard money to protect us from the central banks. But anyway, they put that election on the Bitcoin blockchain and timestamps. We've been talking about this for a while. Why do we still not use that technology? Because we know that it's used as a tool. whenever you want to take a country that has massive resources, remember, why did Guatemala have an election on the Bitcoin blockchain? Well, because they're only the 71st country for oil resources. That's not sexy enough as Venezuela. Venezuela has the most amount of oil resources. We don't seem to care about corrupt regimes and dictators and exporting democracy until suddenly there's a lot of resources that we can exploit. And the only countries that receive IMF loans are the ones where there's a lot of resources that can be exploited. And we need to care about exporting democracy only with the countries where there are a lot of resources to back those loans from the IMF so that we can destroy them through debt slavery printed by the US Federal Reserve that backs the International Monetary Fund and uses economic hitmen to implement regime changes so that we can back taking out those corrupt, evil dictators. We've seen this before, where the statue falls down and the local people are cheering, and then that justifies the expansion of the NATO proof of weapons network, just when China started to issue Belt and Road Initiative loans in Venezuela. And remember China's policy, they said, we want diplomatic ties, but when you get a Belt and Road Initiative loan, no regime change, no interference in politics. So now all these countries have to choose between the IMF regime change, which leads to toppling of their governments and media control to make you feel a certain way, or China, which says, we'll lend you the money, but you have to implement the Chinese yuan or the BRICS currency as a world reserve currency, but we promise we won't interfere in your politics. Will they hold that promise? It will probably change later, but you know who they're going to choose, which is why we have this movement towards de-dollarization, because China has a peace plan and America has a war plan. Does that mean that I love the Chinese Communist Party? Hell no. We should resist, and all the Chinese people should resist against all the oppression that's happening within China, and Bitcoin is the power that does it. And now if Trump makes it a strategic reserve, then so does China have to do that, which is why my prediction is China will remove the Bitcoin mining ban, because it is now geopolitically and national security important for countries to be engaging in Bitcoin mining and using their resources, which brings me full circle to the interview that we saw today. Make sure you catch up on it on our next Bitcoin country in South America with our next Bitcoin president, and how Bitcoin can engage in changing the world by open sourcing all of these closed source proof of weapons network with proof of work and Bitcoin. So we don't need to exert these regime change, but the next generation can rise up against their government armed with Bitcoin so that we can change the world with digital, hard, sound money in a peaceful process, hopefully. But anyway, we have seen, you will watch it again, US implements regime change. We're all meant to be happy. And then the US gets to, take advantage of those oil resources. And so what did the US announce that we had today? So here's the headline. United States officially declares Edmundo Gonzalez as the winner of the Venezuelan presidential elections against Maduro. So America just declares it. But we also know that America will never have deep concern about the human rights violations in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. Why? Because they've already done that. They control those regimes. They've got those treaties, and they can sell those weapons to those military industrial complexes already. It always starts with resources. Venezuela, oil and gas. Remember, it has the largest oil reserves in the world. 300 billion barrels. But what is unique about Venezuela's crude oil versus US and Saudi Arabia? It is really, really heavy. And so you need a industry and infrastructure in order to work with it, in order to refine that crude oil. This is when sanctions come in. You fire a proof of weapons network, financial weapon of mass destruction called sanctions, and now Venezuela cannot cooperate with international companies in order to refine their oil. So now it's got this useless resource, and in order to fight back against it, they have to work with other countries that are sanctioned. And then Russia supports them, or Iran supports them, and then you implement more and more sanctions, and that leads to political corruption. And because those resources are there, we need to now be concerned about that political corruption, and we need to overthrow those and export democracy through these international relations. There's something, by the way, just the final to wrap it up here. I wanted to include here the Monroe Doctrine. This is what the United States said, which is that if anyone like European Union interferes in South American policy, then any intervention in the political affairs in South America is considered any interference in the affairs in the American regions. This is considered a hostile act against the United States. These high-profile sanctions are being used in order to create civil unrest, then regime change. You wreck the governments. What comes next is a lot worse for the people, more death, more destruction, and then we need to have these diplomatic ties so those resources can be used. And then we criticize them. So this is why I say China has a peace plan, America has a war plan, not because I love those governments, because diplomatic ties is the way to do it and allow the people to fight back by having a younger generation that gets Bitcoin, implements it, all these open source movements into their economies, which is why Bitcoin does need to be involved in politics to fight the oppression of the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, in order to have a peaceful change. And then obviously we're told that we need to worry about illegal immigration at the same time. So, you know, you've seen it before. Look at these regime change. US has opened borders. Suddenly you're told that you need to concern yourself. Who did you originally have to concern yourself? Well, the places where you had those sanction and regime change: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and now the next wave comes from Venezuela. So if you want to support that, if you want to not have this problem, just stop doing your covert operations in the US and recognize that it's not about exporting democracy. It's about America's freedom and British freedom on the back of other people's oppression, which is why this is all a Bitcoin story. It always was a Bitcoin story because in 2008, that white paper was released to fight back against the proof of weapons network. And it supported WikiLeaks to expose the acts of the government when the financial system tried to blockade it. Bitcoin saved it, and we got the truth. And you're idiots trying to listen to the media that is not telling you the truth. And this is expanding the proof of weapons network. And now I will keep reporting on this. And even China came out and they made a public statement. Yeah, we don't listen to China. We know the atrocities that they're committing. But their statement today said, we are not the US. We do not want to become like the US. China does not pursue homogeneity or practice power politics. It's saying China has the best record on peace and security amongst all major countries. And so with this, Saudi Arabia came out and supported the China plan to negotiate diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and said that it wants to strengthen its diplomatic ties with Iran at the same time as getting all of its defense from America and deciding whether it wants to be BRICS. And we have this changing moment in history that we all get to explore together. Real peace comes from allowing the Middle East to be peaceful, stop exploiting its resources, stop exploiting the African resources, retreat American foreign policy, allow Saudi Arabia and Iran to normalize, allow China to negotiate with its record, and also China to allow its negotiations, which involves working with Israel, working with Palestine on self-determination, working with Saudi Arabia, having a BRICS corridor so that US can create the best currency it wants to create, BRICS can create the best currency it wants to create, and we have central bank digital currencies compete with each other, with Bitcoin as the resistance movement that regulates the regulator. And Ukraine came to China and said, can you help us engage in peace talks with Russia, because NATO wants to expand, and NATO expansion means fueling the proof of weapons network and leaving Ukraine in a worse situation where it has to give up more land and it has to kill more Ukrainians and more Russians, all because America doesn't want China to look strong. And so instead, it says we continue what we are doing, and we continue to sanction, and we continue the foreign policy, and we continue to use the media in order to make people think that this is what Netanyahu said, the barbarians against civilized society. Let's all hold back against our government. And this is why Xi Jinping came out today and said that BRICS is changing the world. And we all know that those governments are going to be just as bad, but we're going to be a lot more educated, with a lot more freedom of speech, with a lot more information. And we're going to have Bitcoin that helps us rebuild all of these countries, not the IMF, not China's Belt and Road Initiative, not the Federal Reserve. We get to opt out. And that is why I want as many people to do it peacefully, own more Bitcoin, as many companies to own more Bitcoin, and as many countries to be engaging in the political process of taking back your sovereignty and having strategic asset reserves in order to protect yourself from your occupation by central banks. And I will continue to share this. It used to take me 1 hour. Now it takes 2 hours. I'm sorry, but I have to report and document this whole journey that we are sharing together. And as long as people give us less news to cover, then these episodes will be shorter. But this is episode 41 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Many are going to get wrecked. Many are going to die. I want you to stay alive, and I want you to remain financially sovereign and own your own money, spend your own money, and beat inflation and stay on the right side of this change. If you would like to join me on that journey, please get yourself a free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. I'm going to be releasing video series after the halving, and I'm going to be covering a video series which I do every 4 years after halving, where I reveal live exactly how I invest. We're creating the animation right now. That will be available to all members that have a free login on simondixon.com and are a member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Join me on that journey so that we can do it with peace, love, and unity, and create your login, and I'll share all those details and all the other things so that we can make sure you're on the right side of the change. Enjoy your weekend. I'll see you all next week, And this will be for next week in Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics. Peace.